Hey, so welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to design some cloth from imagination. So I'm gonna go through a bit of an analysis or a process that you can try before you actually start drawing cloth, and that'll kind of help you visualize where tension points are and where folds are going to be, and how to kind of plot things out and plan things first. And then I'm going to go into a demo using that sort of analysis to draw different kinds of cloth and drapery, and maybe some tighter clothing and some more some thicker or more flowy clothing. And yeah, hopefully you can pull some tips and tricks and try some of these methods out. I've kind of gone a little bit, not overboard, but I've done my analysis pretty rigorously. It's not something you have to do every time you draw. I mostly do this analysis that sort of just like in my head, I just visualize where things are going to be, but actually drawing it out and plotting it can be a really good way of just visualizing it and putting a plan to paper. So let's start. So as a sort of mannequin, I drew these figures out. So I have two female ones and a male one, and I just put some really basic shading just to give me an idea of the forms. So I think the most important thing when drawing cloth is to be aware of the 3D nature of your mannequin, the 3D shape of your subject. And because a lot of cloth is the properties of cloth are a reaction to how things drape over the 3D object, and how things react to gravity, and how they react to tension and compression points. So yeah, so these mannequins will just serve as a good sort of like framework on which we can build our cloth. So the first step, basically we're gonna do this in sort of 3 steps. First, we're gonna look at the main tension points, so points where cloth will drape away from, and then we'll look at the sort of direction, and the direction is really just how what the primary, how cloth will fall away from those tension points and what direction they'll take. And then we'll look at compression points, and that really happens when sort of 2 tension points collide and sort of intersect, and so they're kind of pushing cloth together. So we're kind of simulating this in our head. So the first thing I sort of try to visualize is the tension points, and then the sort of ridges. If you can kind of think of it as if you were to hold a towel in your hand, you'd have one main tension point, right? And then the towel would fall away, and then a ridge would be something like a curtain rod. So you have multiple points placed along a line, and tension points drape away from it that way. So basically your tension points are going to be ridges and faces of your subject matter that are pointing upward. So these tension points are basically a reaction to gravity. Gravity is the main force pulling the cloth downward. So you want to find faces that actually point up toward the sky and that protrude outward. So when we look at points like the shoulders or the elbows, these are all upward facing planes of the body. So you can see I'm not putting any on the lower back, or any on the bottom of the buttocks, or the bottom of the arm, or the bottom of the leg. Everything is pointing upward towards the sky, right? On the bicep, the shoulder, the chest, right? So the way I sort of plot these or think of these, first I try to think of bony landmarks. So you have a couple bony landmarks that'll cause sort of you'll see them more often because as cloth wraps around, they're like a hard object that's under the cloth, so you kind of see them poking out. So bony landmarks like the elbows here, collarbones, and then the aces on the pelvic ridge, or even the pelvic ridge itself, depending on how thin the character is. Sometimes you can see more or less bones poke through. And then we have on the rib cage, we have this sort of Roman arch. So this arch that the rib cage creates, and you can kind of see it here. And then things like the hip bone, you know, pushing outward. You'll see it more prominently on females, and because the men tend to have more like square butts. And then the scapula. So the scapula pokes out in the back. I tried to pick a couple of different angles so we can look at the main ones. And then the sort of back of the hips are another significant landmark. So all of these points are sort of pointing upward, and sort of forming different kinds of ridges that the cloth would drape off of. Sometimes I'll depending on how tight the clothing is, if the clothing wraps around the body, then you start to get secondary folds that happen, because tension is created within the cloth because of how tight it's wrapped, and so it's not really reacting to gravity anymore. It's more with like drapery and a looser cloth that will it's solely affected by gravity and not by inner tension. So something like this ridge here, which is kind of hidden underneath the pec, might not be important for like a looser shirt or something. You might just have the cloth, you know, draping down like this. But for a tighter shirt that is wrapping around the body, then you'll have tension between these 2 points as it kind of like wraps around the form, right? So so these are the first sort of things I tried to plan out. Then I try to look at, okay, if cloth is sort of originating from these tension points, how does it wrap around the form, and in which direction does that tension go? So here, actually, first we have a little bit of a gradient. So tension will become less significant as you move away from those ridges. So that's just to visualize that. And then these are the sort of tension directions, right? So I'll just drop this down a little bit more so that we can see these. So you can see all these lines are wrapping around the form, and this is why I sort of shaded in these mannequins so that I can kind of visualize that 3D shape a little bit better. And they're all eventually pointing downward, right? They're falling with gravity like a waterfall. So tension leaves, it originates from these ridges, right? And then it wraps around the form and kind of takes the path of least resistance downward to like a vertical direction. So we can see any point or any ridge on this form has lines radiating away from it, and they're all, you know, wrapping around the form and then falling downward, kind of like a waterfall. So this will help you plot the direction of your folds, because folds radiate away from tension points, whether they be lines or points on the body. It's ultimately that. So you can see how I did that on this figure, and you can see also if you have sort of two rails that are close together, so you can see them here, there's kind of like two parallel lines, you'll have the cloth drape in between them, right? So the tension lines will sort of meet at the center, because they're close together. So you can see that kind of happening here. You see that here on the chest. You know, you have a tension point or ridge created by the collarbone and by the pec. So you'll have the direction of the tension will kind of link them together. Same thing at the hips. You know, you have two tension points or ridges on the side of the hips, so the cloth will sort of a drape in between them. Once they kind of get too far away though, so you can see that we have like the crotch and the leg, they're kind of two separate forms. So those tension points will start more like colliding instead of linking. So they're kind of going in two different directions now, and that sort of change in direction is what's going to create compression. So a compression force in the cloth, creating folds that kind of go in the opposite direction. So cloth will drape, parallel to tension lines, right? And perpendicular to compression lines. So if we have, here I'll kind of illustrate it down here. So here we have like a piece of cloth like this, right? So this is a tension point. We have tension radiating away from the cloth, and ultimately whenever there's tension there's compression in the opposite direction, so we'll have compression going in this direction, right? Same thing for like if it's draping between 2 points, right? Let's say we have like these are like diaper folds. So we have tension going in the direction of the cloth, but we have compression in this direction, right? Okay, lots of lines. So finally I've kind of like gone through, and my last step is to kind of isolate where I know there's going to be compression. So this blue here is representing where there's contact points between different parts of the body. So these are like significant changes in direction for the cloth. You'll have a lot of compression just because of the contact, right? There's like weight pressing down on the body. And here you can see where the tension, the direction of the tension folds kind of merge or start colliding together. Then we get, we'll get compression in these kinds of areas. So areas like armpits, the crook of the elbow, where if a hand or an arm or something is resting on the body, in the hips, you can see these compression points are almost the same on all the figures. So around the hips, in the butt, and the crotch area, you'll get a lot more compression folds. So that's basically it for the analysis. In the next part, we'll look at how we can start plotting our seams. So seams are going to present a sort of secondary element to the tension points, because folds also, like smaller folds, radiate away from seams. And and we can start planning out our cloth. So we'll see you in the next part. Okay, so in this part we are going to draw some cloth. So this will just be a demo, and I'll sort of talk through. I might refer back to my analysis as I draw, but I'll be talking about my process sort of in real time. So let's start with like a basic example. So we'll draw a normal like t-shirt on this guy. So the t-shirts have a collar, so we can do let's do like just make sure that I'm drawing on the right layer. Let's do like a sort of like a V-neck collar. It doesn't need to be super perfect, it's just to kind of like plot things out. We can figure out where it's going to sit on the arm, so we'll have it wrap around the bicep. We won't really see it on this side. And then we can find like an end point. So here we'll have it sort of rest a little bit lower than the hips, something like that. So this will be sort of the bottom of the t-shirt. And then shirts like the one I'm wearing right now, they have a couple seams. So you have a seam right at the shoulder that wraps around the arm. So we can throw that seam in here, and this will help plot some secondary tension folds. So here, and we won't quite see it on the other side. And then we have a seam that kind of runs in between the collar and the shoulder. So we can kind of run that and sort of wrap it around something like that. So these are sort of like the boundaries in which we'll be working. And you can kind of see like it's already starting to look kind of like a t-shirt. We don't even have any connecting points. So the trick here is to let the properties of the cloth, whether it be like how big the shirt is or how tight the shirt is, let the folds and stuff dictate the silhouette. You don't want to sort of like just draw like a square or something, and then you have a t-shirt. So unless you have like a super rigid, if your t-shirt's made out of cardboard, the silhouette's going to be a function of the folds that are happening, and the folds, like we discussed in the analysis part, are created by the cloth reacting to tension points and compression on the body. There's also some other little things like torsion. So if a part of the hips is like rotated in relation to the rib cage, then you'll see some torsion in the cloth, and that's just tension that sort of wraps or spirals around the figure. But we'll just kind of keep it simple and stick to just basic forces here. So we'll make the t-shirt a little bit tight, just so that I can kind of demonstrate the tension points a little bit better. It'll be more like an immediate relation to the figure underneath, and I don't need to venture too far away from the forms. So let's just start plotting out our folds. So here we're gonna have some, actually kind of funny, we're starting with some torsion folds. So the arm is rotating up like this, right? So we'll have a little bit of torsion happening here. So if the figure was just resting, then this sort of point on the bicep would link up sort of with the side. So if the arm was down, right, like this, would kind of like face the side here. So we can kind of plot some like radial lines here that are wrapping around the arm. Actually, we do have, is there a seam running down this? Yeah, there is a seam running down the side of my shirt too. So I'm gonna put that in here, just following the form. There, just to keep it simple. Okay, so we can have some radial folds. Actually, I'm gonna just work in shading kind of directly. It for me, I find it helps plot forms better. So here we'll have the t-shirt kind of linking up. We'll have a bit of a band or a seam line around the end of the shirt here. And then these radial folds will sort of wrap around the shoulder. So between the shoulder and the bicep, you'll have a little bit of compression. So you can bring those folds a little bit tighter together. And then in between the seam of the shoulder, we can kind of add some small tension folds that are coming away from it, right? So these are like the seam, how the seam kind of creates another layer of tension. finish this silhouette here. Then around the collar, we're going to have another sort of extra seam just to reinforce the fabric. And we have this tension point here on the collarbone, so we can kind of change the shape of the collar, give it a little bit of a ridge here. So that it follows that shape. Okay. And radiate some more of those folds to the pec and in between the pec. So remember, in our analysis here we have this tension point. So we don't want to put folds really along those tension points. We want to have them existing kind of away to show that the fabric is under tension. So the tension points here, we don't want to like run big folds through there because it'll look like too loose. Okay, and then here we're going to have some compression and tension between these two lines, right? Between the lats and the pec. Try to make the pec like the area that's the most under tension, so that it's kind of like tight around the top of the body and a little bit looser down low. So from this pec, we can kind of, if it's looser down low, we can drop some lines or drop some folds off of that point, so that they'll bunch up at the bottom and they'll kind of radiate downward like that. Here maybe we can plot where some of these folds are coming down. And I'm trying to think of like the lines that as they come down, they're kind of straighter, and then as they get close to the bottom, they kind of like create these sort of zigzag folds to show that they're, you know, draping down and then resting on the bottom. So here we'll do sort of draping shape here. Maybe I don't want to go that far out of the body. Or just something like that. And then I can adjust sort of where my seam is lying. And folds sort of interlock. So if I have this sort of diamond shape, we can have another diamond shape, and they kind of like interlock like this. And that's called a zigzag fold. And you'll see that in areas where the cloth is compressing. So here we have like this line, and then we can send another line sort of in this direction. I'll clean some of this up, you know, it's more about like plotting and getting the general feeling first. And then kind of making sense of the conservation of cloth to make sure you're not adding or subtracting cloth from any given point. So maybe we send some folds around the body. Maybe that's a little bit too much. We'll have a couple folds radiating away to show that there's some tension in the shoulder. Show the seam. And that'll be sort of it for that side. Okay, so now I can drop this back a little bit in opacity. I can clean up some of these lines. So we have this fold coming in. I want to kind of think, okay, where is this originating from? So it's kind of coming in from here, from this sort of area. There's tension under there created by the lat, and then it's going to sort of wrap in and then, you know, jog back, something like that. And then the seam here is going to run down the side of the body and then wrap around that shape, the fold, kind of wrap under. And here we can have another one originating from underneath. And now I need to sort of resolve this part here. So it can be kind of tricky because we have all these lines and jogs and stuff, but basically if cloth originates as a flat shape, like this, I'll just draw like a square, and it's compressed into something like that, then this edge can't be any longer than this original edge, right? So maybe I need to scale that down to show that it's being compressed. And then the same goes for all the different edges. So if I plot this one on like the back side, right here, then this edge needs to stay the same length as that one, and then I can kind of connect those points together, right, to show that it's being pushed together. And the same goes for any point on the cloth. So if that's the total length of the side of the body, then that needs to be conserved in the front and in the back. And you know, it's really hard to do it perfectly, but the idea is to make it believable, not perfect. So here maybe we can throw this one coming down to this side. Throw a couple random ones, and then we can finish off the bottom Actually, this needs to come out so that it covers the hip. And then we can have the sort of seam of the bottom of the shirt. Maybe we have some tension here coming off the pec, so this line is going to be a little bit straighter. And kind of indicating where tension's coming off here, and then it's coming in, and then it's kind of going back out and it kind of zigzagging down. Okay, and here we basically have our t-shirt drawn in. I can give it a little bit of thickness on the edges. But that's looking all right. Okay, now to shade it, I basically want to follow, if I bring my figures back, I want to sort of follow the shading of the figure underneath. So I could even copy this just to give me like a starting point. So let's copy that here, and I'm going to drop that in opacity a bit. Don't need to show the abs or any of that stuff because that's hidden. And then I can sort of adjust my shading to add the secondary forms of the folds. So bringing sort of the peaks and valleys out. And then here we're going to have like a big form fold from the side of the body. This is all shadow on this side, so I don't really care too much about showing any detail in there. I need to show the shoulder. Give a little bit of like shadow to the seams to show that the cloth is kind of digging in, right? So when you stitch something together, it kind of like pushes the cloth in on itself. Some cast shadows. And then here, so these tension folds are going to kind of create little sort of triangular shapes. But they're sort of in the light side of the torso, so I don't need to show them too much. And same for these. If they're in the light, they're not going to you know, you can add halftone to show them, kind of like that, but it can be really, really light. I'm going to sort of, just for the aesthetic, I'm going to sort of erase some of these internal lines and just stick to describing the folds with the shading. Here we can have sort of cast shadow of the pec. So I'm trying to think of like how these shapes change the volume of the figure, the underlying figure, and then simplifying those changes into light and shadow shapes. So here we'll have, you know, a fold radiating from the pec, and that'll sort of create a form shadow and a cast shadow. And then we have we can't forget the form shadow of the torso underneath. Bring some of the ridges from this side into light, and then show their form and cast shadows. So form shadow and then a cast shadow underneath. Form shadow and cast shadow underneath. Here, what's all bunched together, you can kind of go with a little bit more contrast. I want the cast shadows to be a little bit more, a little sharper than the form shadows. So as the shadow rolls around the object, it's going to have a softer fall off, like here. And then where you have cast shadows, like here, is going to be sharper. And then I can sort of sculpt with like a little bit of halftone, just the changes in the planes. So I don't want these to be as dark as my shadows, but it kind of helps describe the rest of the 3D shape here. I want somewhere on the ridge to be the brightest point. And add some small like secondary folds here. Oh, I didn't want to leave that in. flipping my canvas from time to time just to check. Maybe I add another little tension fold here. That'll sort of fall off. As I'm shading stuff, I can sort of erase away some of the lines, some of the messy lines from my drawing, so that I get a cleaner result. So here, just adding some halftone. And now I'll merge these together just to clean up the final drawing. The idea here is to still be able to see the form, the underlying forms. Like you can see the shape of the text, they still exist here, and I'm revealing that by the use of shadows and by just like kind of cutting through the shadows with tension, with highlights that are caused by tension folds here. Reinforce some of my core shadows. Maybe this one's a little bit too deep. Should be something like that, maybe. Even add a little bit of bounce light, like in the shadows. So that'll be on the bottom portions, like under the pec here, and then it'll be a bit darker in the cast shadow portion. And by like pushing and pulling the light, I can kind of, sculpt some interesting shapes. There's just pouring rain outside. Huge thunderstorm just started. Okay, and then finally I'll just add a little bit of sort of hatching texture just to show a change in textural qualities here from the collar. I also want to be pretty light on this in the light, and I can go a little bit darker close to the shadow. just stick to this. And if we select our t-shirt now, I'm going to do this with my other layer turned off. So I'm just using the lasso tool. I'm holding Option to change between the freeform and the geometry. So I'm holding Option, Alt or Option with my thumb. So I can select this in basically one pass. Done. There you go. Go on a layer under, and I'll just fill that with white. And there we go. We've got a nice t-shirt, right? So this is derived from this information. If we bring that back, you can see that the folds I'm using are sort of radiating from these tension points here. And then there's more folds on the bottom just because of the amount of cloth. So the torso is tapering down, but the cloth is staying the same. So it'll sort of bunch up. And then, I'm not including any big folds like on the bicep, and on the shoulder, there's just small sort of secondary folds created by the seam line. So I'm leaving the areas of tension pretty free of folds, and then basically filling the gaps. So yeah, I'm just going to kind of cover some stuff that I was thinking about, and some interesting aspects of the different designs. So I wasn't that focused on designing something interesting, but more just like demoing different aspects of drawing cloth. So if I overlay this analysis part, you can see how we have less detail at our tension points, unless, like this case, I added a seam and kind of scrunched up the fabric to connect to that seam. But in general, we have less detail at those tension points, and it kind of drapes away. You can see that, like here we have no folds like crossing through that tension point, and then the folds kind of link up to this tension point in the crotch area where there's some compression and tension lines radiating out from it. So in this design, I added some additional tension points here, so we can really see how, with these straps hanging over the shoulder, that's countering, gravity, and holding up these pieces of fabric, so there would be some sort of like clip under here or hole in the fabric where it could hold up. And then the folds are radiating away from this tension point. So you can see how the diaper fold here on the hood, they kind of jog and wrap around to connect to the other side. And then under here, so this fabric would connect up to the back of this, but basically the folds are draping and connecting up to this tension point on the elbow. So even though the elbow is hidden, we can kind of see it through the cloth with that tension point. And the same thing's happening here, where we have the end of the elbow, and then the cloth folds are linking up to it. And you can see as they link up to the elbow, we have some scrunching happening. So there's compression happening, you know, perpendicular to that. But towards the end, this doesn't have a lot of wrinkles and stuff, because this bottom edge is going to be in tension too. And then here we can see a lot of different areas where the cloth is compressing at the hip. So we have the main hip kind of joint there, but even here, you know, we have some cloth kind of draping down and then linking up to the other side, kind of like that. And then, you know, we have the butt kind of pushing out, so we have some tension in between. This is a bit of a thinner cloth, so we have some compression here, and those folds are radiating around. And I think that's about it for this one. This one is a bit of an interesting case where we have some aspects that are skin tight and that flare out. So I tried to create a dress that was kind of like skin tight around the torso, and then that fabric kind of scrunches up along the seam on the side, so that would kind of like hug the figure closely. And then as we get down to the bottom of that seam, the cloth sort of flares out. So yeah, so this seam on the side is not only compressing the cloth in the sort of like vertical direction, kind of like that, creating all these like scrunch folds, but is also acting as a sort of like ridge where all the folds radiate away from, right? All the way down. I tried to do a sort of like folded over collar. It's not really like reading as well as I thought it would, but you know, can't win every battle. You can kind of see it draping in the back here as well, so just adding to the silhouette. And then in the gloves are pretty straightforward, like trying to find the crook of the elbow, and we have some cloth radiating away from that, and making sure that there's no cloths going through the elbow, because that's a tension point. And then we have, often you'll see sort of spiraling folds around the forearm, because as you pronate and supinate your forearm or your hand, you're rotating your hand in relation to your elbow, so you'll kind of get some spiral folds often in the forearm. So that just kind of wraps around, just to give a bit of movement to those gloves. And then at the wrists, I'll have some more folds, and at the junctions of the fingers too. So just to show that there's you know, compression happening at that joint, that the folds are scrunching up. And this is like sort of, I'm thinking the same thing when I'm doing this than when I'm drawing fabric. So basically I'm creating like a leading line, so I have a tension point here where these strings or beads or whatever they could be are attached, and I'm sort of draping them in between this ridge here. So that's the uppermost part of the arm, and those are kind of draping down and over and wrapping around. So in total, like, they would go behind the arm and wrap up to the back, so they would kind of create this saddle sort of shape. So we'd have the front part and then the back part, and the arm kind of wraps through like a cylinder, like that, basically. So yeah, you can kind of think of these like saddle shapes when you're drawing different things. Even like, you know, this hood, I'm thinking of how the cloth kind of wraps around and what's hidden in the back. Same thing for the dress. Like I want to make sure to show some of the dress on the other side, so maybe there's not this cut, and it just kind of wraps around, sort of like that, and then wraps, back around. So often for dresses or tubes of fabric, sleeves, things like that, you'll often see like the edge of that fabric can often be represented by either like an ellipse. So in the case of like the t-shirt here, we have sort of ellipse that's going around the arm, right? It's kind of, we can simplify it to an ellipse, even though the cross section with the bicep and tricep is a little bit more complex. But even here, it's like you can simplify that to an ellipse, like a sort of structural shape like this, and then maybe the elbow is a bit more of like, some sort of like triangular prism or something, and then we have the forearm coming out, which is going to be like another ellipse in the other direction. So you want to make sure that those edges kind of conform to the shape of the underlying mannequin. And in situations like this skirt, you can kind of create like just a random squiggly line that's kind of wrapping around the figure, and then you can use the edges of those lines. This is not a great example because you can't really see, like if I do something like that. So you can kind of use the edges of the line to represent, how it's folding in and out. That as like these kind of tube shapes. And then you just hide what's behind that. And if it happens to be like a translucent fabric, then you kind of can make sense of what's behind by just drawing, the curve and the overlaps and stuff, like that. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say on these studies, and hopefully you can take away some good information. But just to make things clear, these are all done from imagination. So I wasn't using reference for any of these, but it just shows you like the power of like studying the properties of your subject matter, and then applying it to something that you create from invention or from imagination, and how powerful just like analyzing those properties can be. It's not just fabric, but like it can be anatomy, or it can be mechanical design. It reinforces your visual library, but makes it easier for you to just tackle stuff and invent things in a believable way. So it's going to be it for this video. Thanks for hanging around, and we'll see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao.